thank you very much, everyone, for coming and listening to all of us. And thank you very much, Anda, for the invitation to bring me across Europe. One thing I want to talk about tonight is essentially lighting education and how we see light and how everyone is promoting light in our industry. Much of what you will hear when you work in lighting or deal with lighting or people selling you light fittings, it doesn't matter. You will always hear about lux and lumen and uniformity. Now I want to give you an idea that there is another way of designing light, and it is one that is to do with the human being, how we see, how we enter space, how we feel, and how comfortable we are. This is what lighting is very much about, and how architecture communicates to the people that are within it. Now I myself am an architect. 20 years ago I was struggling as an architecture student, not really understanding what all these arguments were for a dynamic 23 degrees. Should it be pointy? Should it be curvy? What was the meaning? What was the meaning of this architecture? And after 2.5 years, I was almost ready to remove myself from the course. But then I found a minimalist tutor who introduced me to the joys of Louis Kahn. Now, in Louis Kahn, I discovered a whole philosophy of what architecture is. Because separate and parallel to my studies for being an architect, I was also training to be a Buddhist meditator, possibly. Whether I would end up in a monastery or an architect's office, I could never quite work out. But here, with Louis Kahn, I found a complete blending of and an understanding of what meditation, what mind, how the process of perception, and of who we are, and how architect may reflect this. So the room is the beginning of architecture. It is the place of the mind. And this is the important thing. If you're dealing with an architect, you're dealing with somebody who has the willpower to influence material. This is the important thing. And to understand an architect and what architecture is, you have to understand that the building is the end result. Architecture is the process. The act of building is a verb. It is an action. But the design of a building or architecture is the process of a philosophy where the building is the end result. And this is the important thing of what lighting is. Lighting communicates us. It reflects us. We see in ourselves as light. Now this is something that it's a bit of a strange thing to say, but after 20 years of working in lighting design, my first projects being car parks, etc., I will show you the various projects I've worked on. If you understand the idea of the architect, if you understand the idea and the purpose and the reason for the building, your lighting will communicate that from the building to the occupant sitting in that space. And if you understand how that person sits within that space, how comfortable they are, what their task is, what they're trying to do, what they believe, then you have a successful piece of architecture. So over my 20 years, not only have I been working, producing these buildings, I've also been writing a thesis exactly on this topic and how it may influence how we look at light and how we look at architecture and even how we look at the history of architecture. And in that I have been making my own personal modern art pilgrimages to every Louis Kahn building there is, and had the great fortune of being able to go around the Salk Institute. The Salk Institute actually is the this is the main studying centre of neuroscience in the world. And so it's not by accident that they have Louis Kahn in this sky space that integrates light and space within the very fabric of the building to actually create the material. So I was very lucky. When I left college, my final buildings were empty spaces filled with projectors, and I was noticed by a lighting design company who gave me a job, which was very nice. And the lighting industry over the last 20 years in London has become enormous. The practice I was in has become enormous from that time. And London is now recognised as a world centre of lighting design. And so designers working in London are actually working in every country on the planet. Now this was my second project, but this is what's now as the O2, unfortunately corporate logos, but the architecture here and the lighting of it is an expression of the structure of the tension of the heating units, the air handling. Now all of that, that air handling unit there, the heat that's pumping out of it, that's all grey, that's metallic. The colour there is all being projected into it as an expression of the forces and the purpose and the use of it. But also what you'll notice here is as a piece of landscape lighting, there are no light columns, there are no projections above your head. The most important thing that you have to understand, that light entering your eye is glare. Light entering your eye is a problem. Light must hit something, record that material and reflect into your eye and tell you what that material is. So what you'll see here is an external space that actually has light directed on all the material around you. There is no light pointing at you. So there are no lux levels, uniformity for this space, but the building glows and everyone can see each other around it. Now that was one of my first projects 17, 18 years ago, and a project that was completed last year for the UK Pavilion for the Milan Expo. The idea for this was the hive of industry and the relationship of bees, the work of bees, and also the plight of bees. The Expo philosophy was feeding the planet. And I'm pleased to say that this pavilion has won many awards, more than 25 in total. And this is because the lighting concept is so clear. It's singular. It is about the relationship between the plants and the health of the bees, but also the direct experience of a hive, the communication, the actual action happening between the bees themselves. All the LEDs inside the sculpture, which you're able to walk into the hive, is a live link up to a real beehive in Nottingham, local to where the artist is living. But the important thing here is that there is a landscape, there is a conference centre, it is a bar, ambassadorial meetings are happening here. We had the Prime Minister open this. I was invited onto the project to sort out the emergency lighting and the kitchen. I said, excuse me, what is the purpose, what is the reason of this building? And so with the landscape, again, the main purpose and the event of this is the artwork, is the hive. So all understanding of how you enter the space, the orientation and direction of your eye, means that as you're walking around the space, the light is near your feet where you change level. The landscape itself, how many landscapes have we seen lit only 1 inch above the floor? But this is important. Your view towards the sculpture and the main event is unobstructed. There is no light shining at you, it glows directly at you. And so here underneath the hive was actually the conference centre itself. And we took the idea and the message of the relevance of the concept and the purpose of the bees. But here you can see that we've actually delivered the emergency lighting in a completely integrated way into the handrails and actually specified honey colour as all of the uniform light within the space. So where we have a bar, we can't illuminate a bar where we have the sculpture and obstruct the view of it. So we light the perimeter, your eye becomes comfortable, it adjusts to the light level, but there is an accent under the floor so that people milling around are actually illuminated, but your view to the sculpture in the entrance is unobstructed. Even in the conference room, we wanted to understand how light may emit or glow inside a hive. What is the internal experience? Now, that same practice of understanding what is in a space, I'm also currently applying to the largest timber secular structure in Europe. This is the Palace of Westminster. This is the oldest and original part. It's over 800 years old, and you may recognise it. It is the roof used in the Harry Potter films. But the important thing here is we won this competition because we are the only lighting designers that pointed out that chandeliers are foreign and a modern invention. If we actually look at this roof and we studied it, how the daylight may have activated within the roof, its purpose of its design is essentially the way the light entered the space, and it was originally seen 600, 700 years ago. We want to bring that effect back. Now, the most important thing about lighting is it constantly changes. We're dealing with different faculties with the human eye and the brain. And so light, whenever you look at a building outside or you look at a landscape, Monet very much famously pointed this out, but everything constantly changes, but your eye is removing that change. And so in lighting, you're right at the forefront, and you have to deal with this. So what we're very much used to is during the day a cool, crisp atmosphere, but in the evening, you know, we have spent thousands of years evolving our eyesight to understand this condition. Now, about 10 years ago, I wrote this, which was a use of our old-fashioned lamps. All of these lamps, only now in the last year or 2 years, will have been replaced by LEDs. But there's generally a process of what we need to, as lighting designers, develop that change within a space so that we understand that someone comfortable in the morning is sitting in a different condition from someone that is sitting in that same space in the evening. Our reason for being there, our task, our purpose, but also our biology has actually changed. And so this further evolved, and this is now a diagram I'm using in most projects now, which is actually the orientation of that light. So there's a huge difference between having this cool, crisp, concentrated light that's relative to the morning above your head and diffuse to very specific, almost like a candlelit atmosphere. I mean, any of you will experience, you know, we're very comfortable sitting in a dimly lit, luxurious restaurant in the evening or a cinema in the evening. It feels uncomfortable to go and see a film at 9:30 in the morning. Our actual hormonal balance of our brain and actually our fundamental idea of the purpose and what we're doing at that time of the day has actually been structured for thousands of years. And so within our eye, we see light in slightly different ways depending on its colour, its tone, its vibration. So we have to understand exactly what's happening there. And also between daytime and nighttime, our eyesight sensitivity to different colours changes dramatically. We become 20 times more sensitive to blue light, whereas during the day we're actually peak sensitivity attracted to a sort of acid yellow light, which we find desperately unpleasant if we see it in the evening. This is also where a scheme that can look really good during the day can look terrible at night, and vice versa. And so here, within the balance and the peak intensities, many people will be hearing literature at the moment about all of our white LEDs. Blue peak intensity is actually directly keeping us awake at night. This is something to look into. Our sensitivities to the different colours vary greatly, but also at night time, and this is something I've been publishing and researching over the last 10 years, is that the colour blue at the low light levels, physically within our eye, pure blue light is out of focus. Our eyesight is structured so that only 2 degrees is actually in focus, that we see clearly. Everything else is a cloudy vision that's actually constructed from memory. And so if you think about this, 98% of what you're seeing is constructed and is projected out from your mind. So this is very important. Your mind is embedded in what you think you're seeing. So I've done this study over the last 4 years, where I've surveyed most lighting designers in Europe, and I've done a parallel study across the US as well. We have 400 contributors to this survey. And even when you add up all the other colours together, shades of white, etc., definitely lighting designers are using blue as a very powerful material at night. But the interesting thing that came out of this was, what is the reason for it? And symbolism was still up there directly as number one. And it's a very simple thing I can indicate. Blue water is frequently used. Yellow water and brown water, not quite so attractive. And so as I was presenting this back here at the Salk Institute in San Diego, I actually met Thomas Albright, who has been studying the exact connections within the visual cortex. He's been doing unpleasant things to mice, but he's been actually dyeing the neural network and actually tracing exactly which neuron is connecting to which. Unfortunately, I met him on the second day I was there. The day before, I'd actually climbed over the bins and through the kitchen, pretending to be a scientist in the building, not knowing it was actually open to the public, but there you go. But this is one of his diagrams, and he makes a wonderful observation that the actual visual cortex and the neuron connections between them all has a very strong resemblance to the Tokyo metro system. But here, so it's what happens after your eye has just removed all information and light, adjusted all information on colour, etc., that it then goes into the brain and into the back of your visual cortex. As I say again, everything that you're seeing is then constructed and reflected back. So we're dealing with the mind, and we're dealing with constancy. Now I'm sure this comedy hasn't translated this far across Europe, but essentially our character here is explaining, no, the small cows are further away. We understand what the colour of something is. Now this is the reason why this is such a debate, because what you have here is an object where there's not quite enough information to tell you about the light. So it's perfectly 50-50. And all of those colours are in the mid-tone grey range. So this is where people can physically see the difference. Now when you actually see this dress, if you've ever seen a detailed study on it, it is a black dress with blue detailing. So we're dealing with the mind. So over the last 10 years, I've also been collecting the complete works of C.G. Jung or Carl Jung, and in terms of having the complete works, I'm able to do surveys now on any word that relates to light, and I've now built a database of exactly what he's written about light, dark, fear, motivations, etc. And this to me is the most important quote that I can find that actually relates to what we do all day, every day. The wave movements or solar emanations that meet my eye are translated by my perception into light. It is my mind with its store of images that gives the world colour and sound. And that supremely real and rational certainty, which I call experience, is in most simple form an exceedingly complicated structure of mental images. Thus there is, in a certain sense, nothing that is directly experienced except the mind itself. We are so enveloped in a cloud of changing and endlessly shifting images that we might well exclaim with a well-known skeptic, nothing is absolutely true, and even that isn't. So thick and deceptive is this fog about us that we have to invent exact sciences in order to catch at least a glimmer of the so-called real nature of things. This is my quote when someone asks me for lux level and uniformity. And so you can put together a diagram after reading Mr. Jung for many, many years. And essentially, I don't have time to go through this now in detail, but fundamentals to the foundation of psychology itself. We have issues of forming an ego within the threshold of consciousness. You'll notice the threshold of consciousness is actually quite high. Our unconscious is a vast ocean that sits below us. We have a whole profession now that's been studying this for decades. But in the formation of an ego, something that is certain and definite, we immediately project a shadow. And so we have a whole system of projections, of layering within psychology that's used as everyday language. As soon as we think there is something different, there is a shadow. As soon as we think we're clever, we're automatically surrounded by idiots. Now, this is something very important when you're dealing with a building like St. Paul's Cathedral. How do you analyse a building, a place of worship, a place of great symbolism? Now, again, I could go into 2 hours exactly on the history of what the difference between classical and Gothic architecture is. But what you will find is both Wren and Michelangelo struggled to build a symmetrical cathedral. Their cathedrals had to be stretched. Now, this is something embedded in Christian language. You are in original sin. You must come into the light. You must follow Christ. You must enter from darkness and move into the light. This is actually a Christian scripture. You find with different religions around the world that light is written about in a different way. You find God in light in a different position. And so what you find is here the architecture, no matter how much churches have been tried to make symmetrical, the altar and the nave are always separated, and there is a need to progress. What was very beautiful about working on this cathedral was that we gave them a whole level of theatrical controls, and now the team that work there are plunging this cathedral into darkness for their ceremony in order to bring light to people. So they grabbed it with both hands. 3 years later, I had the real pleasure of working on the Saccharin Mosque in Istanbul. This is the first mosque designed in the world by a woman architect, Zeynep Fadiloglu. She has been very instrumental in bringing a cultural optimism back. But this is very much an even light, a flat light, a symmetrical light. And what you find written through the Quran and the most important scriptures that all are equal in the eyes of God. We're all olives on the same olive tree, burning with the same fire and the same oil. So this became very important as a lantern. Now the controversial part of this mosque was, oh my God, they've lit the dome blue. The sacred colour in Islam is green. The colour of the Prophet is green. But here, using blue, I was just referencing the sky to a candlelight, the warmth below to this ambience and spirituality above. But there were quite a few debates over that colour after they realised just how different this made this mosque look. And then, not so much as a religious structure, but again, understanding exactly what's happening when a person's entering a space and the purpose of this space here, or the whole building. Qatar, the Emir of Qatar, wanted to place his country as a central, educated part of the Gulf, so he sent his family out to build a complete collection of the complete history of Islam. So it has 1,200 years of a collection that spans from Indonesia all the way across to Spain. So often when you work in museums, you get to work on 3 or 4 galleries at a time. This was 24 galleries. It was 264 cases arranged around a central, evenly lit atrium. But one of the problems with light and artifacts is light is energy, light damages artifacts. So you can't put a 600-year-old Quran into daylight, and here we have a museum in the middle of the desert. So we had to influence the design to allow the eye to adjust gradually and imperceptibly before you enter into the gallery. But it's very important here that in this very dark level where you have your treasures, your treasured objects, that they are each illuminated with an intelligence to reveal their texture and their meaning. Now, in building up this gallery, I mean, it's very easy to create a darkened space and just put a little tiny warm glow on the objects. But is it a natural space? Is it a comfortable space? So here we're looking at each artifact. What we found was that you can have an artifact integrated or orientated in any direction, but if you didn't illuminate the face correctly, the artifact made no sense. So we had to help the distribution of the exhibition and its orientation to actually turn artifacts occasionally. Here is a 25-meter carpet. I can tell you that there is not a single point of that carpet that's over 49 lux. So even, we've had to use lux levels and uniformity where required. But this is the important thing for me, is that what you'll notice is the shadows coming in from the artifacts are then grazing consistently through the space. Light is never symmetrical. It is never 90 degrees onto a surface. So this gives you a natural effect of light creeping into a cave. This is a new installation that I've done over the last 6 months that is actually looking at our latest technology, and it raises a question: how much of our current day, of our 15, 16 hours of consciousness per day, is actually looking at a screen, is actually in information. And so we're utilizing this screen and latest technology to actually look at how the light entering our eye, what is the distribution, that is information on a screen. We're designers, we're architects, we're detailing on a screen, we're communicating on a screen, we're designing a building, then everyone comes and experiences it, records each other, and then posts it onto Facebook. Our 2D realm enters the 3D briefly and moves back into the 2D realm. So this question is, when we take our designs and all the information we have on our screen, but we make it the dimensions and parameter of a room, and we look at how the lighting is within our technological spaces, and that information that we're used to seeing on a screen, let's blend the two together and let's start seeing what happens. So this is literally a live experiment. We also have, there's another whole talk that will be coming in the next 5 years, lighting. Now that it's been digitized, LEDs are digitally flickering 10s, 10s, 50,000 times a second. That is information. Wi-Fi will turn into Li-Fi in the next 10 years. Lighting is going to be bought by Google, Facebook, etc. It will be information distribution. So I'm quite pleased to say that future technologies is actually moving into far more this psychological realm. So currently working with Herzog and de Meuron on a new institute in Cambridge. Here we're taking these aspects of health, of the physics of light and the biology, how our body sees, and we're influencing the daylight in this, in understanding clearly how light works, enters into the space. Herzog and de Meuron are not, quite famously, not the easiest architects to work with, but we were able to demonstrate that their building needed to turn 21 degrees to the west in order to facilitate the best working conditions and the visual ambience in their space with the daylight in it. And so here is a projected model, and there's a finished photograph from one of our earlier projects. Again, we have a view of, if we are looking at exactly how someone is sitting in a space and how they're using it, we're no longer talking about light bulbs and the burning of electricity, we're talking about how the light and the form of the spaces around them. So let's talk about the daylight first. Let's not switch any lights on at all, and then only start looking at the light once we've not been able to solve the lighting condition with the building, with the architecture itself. And then we start burning energy. Now this is now producing some very interesting results. Here's an art gallery we have in Essex, which we worked with Raphael Vignoli. We're able to state exactly where they can put artifacts, but they can allow daylight in because we're able to tell them when and where the daylight will be. And yes, we can allow sunlight in, it won't get near the artifacts. We model that and we design the sunlight entrance and penetration into the building. This is affording us massive energy savings. We're talking in the order of 50%. LEDs and changes of technology, we're getting 15% energy saving, 20% energy saving. These are good. Technologies with lighting controls, you only light when and where people are, you get an extra 30-40% energy saving. But if you only light a building when necessary, or you get the daylight correct, you get an additional 40. So we're talking 80% energy saving on conventional building use. And now we're getting data back from our building users saying how much happier and more concentrated they are. Now, I've put this one in as a real example of a pure white space. Yes, there is texture of the wood, but lighting is only at this single detail, making a direct reference to maybe zeroing the gravity. But one of my favourite rooms, because this had a 50% gauze between the daylight and the artificial light. So we were able to control this room in response to the daylight, but we had controls over it to make the room appear or disappear. So in many ways we're dematerializing the room itself. But this is a very important factor here, and almost as a clear vision in many ways of the diagram I showed you earlier, that is a white image. The only colour in that image is the wood of the floor. And so when we actually integrate the light into the space or bring this ambience of the warmth of the material competing with the daylight and balancing against it, we have this very natural effect. Or in a large public retail space, we allow a space to go dark, but we make references to a night sky that we can no longer see. Or we map out buildings of daylight exactly where it is and give an actual map for our other designers to actually start looking at where they can put their exhibitions, their artifacts. Now there's two specific projects I want to show you where the idea that is very clear and very crisp is to lower energy. These next two projects are zero carbon buildings. Their aim is to actually absorb carbon as they're being built. They're fully recyclable, but lighting is 30% of the energy burnt by a building once it's finished. And so over a 50-year or a 75-year period, a total building's energy cost will be 30% of 75%. So you can do the maths on that. But a building's energy use is 3/4 after it's completed. So this building, which is an experimental one in Essex, again is zero carbon. This is not using any carbon for its construction, but we looked at exactly how do we minimize the lighting in here. So we have to deliver codes, we have to deliver uniformity and lux levels in order to get planning permission and various building regs. So we actually decided to say, well, what is the space? So we declared the ground floor a public space that was actually a garden. So we've lit the ground floor of this building to 5 lux, which is okay for a park or for a landscape area, but we declared it a winter garden. We actually defined what the space was and its type. So you see here the whole building is actually absorbing carbon as they're building it. It's also not using any energy for heating. It's using heat exchange through the ground, and it uses natural ventilation. So here's the actual percentage of lighting within it. So a conventional building would be very bad for this. So we actually gave them a promotion of, let's talk about what feels good during the day and what feels good at night, so that when people are comfortable, they'll actually linger longer and maybe they can concentrate more. So for a third of this building, we lit the furniture, we lit where people are seated. We said, yes, we're delivering code, we're delivering 300 larks, but to the task, to the place where the people are setting. Essentially, we didn't light the building at all. So what we looked at as evidence of this is all the different technologies. And one thing you'll see here in the 1950s is a very rapid leap of efficiency. Essentially, the fluorescent lamp enabled cheap electricity for buildings to expand away from daylight. So one thing we wanted to look at was what was lighting in buildings before daylight was removed. And I found these beautiful light fittings from the 1920s. And what you find when energy was expensive, when light was a luxury, it wasn't a necessity, it's used incredibly efficiently and only where required. And so this is how we proposed, using this diagram, to say, for 3/4 of the year, for 3/4 of this building, the lights won't even switch on. You can ask them to switch on, they won't. We're actually going to minimize your carbon consumption. And so we use this image as well, to say in that daylight, we use all of the energy coming from our nuclear fusion generator a few million miles above our head, and then we just have this one single accent in the evening. The room is lit, and we don't need to be burning energy in order to light it, because we understand how the eye relaxes, and we understand how the people inside the space are occupied. Here, this is an atrium that's over 40 meters wide. There are no lights in it. We've got this accent for a complex corridor and just an accent light to the cafe. This is basically lit as a street or an external space. Absolutely not required. And so we get this very sort of familiar, or this sort of almost like old-fashioned form of lighting that's comfortable. And here I found a 19th century philosopher, quite famous for architects, as he wrote The Poetics of Space, but his final book was a study on the poetics of light. But unfortunately he died before he got to the end. So we only have psychoanalysis of fire and the flame of a candle. But here he's talking about in the evening and at night time, people had an intimacy with the light around them. And this is something that we're actually finding in a response from our occupants of these buildings that have been now working in them for 2 years. So this is the other one. This is University of East Anglia. This isn't just zero carbon. Their aim here is to be the most carbon exemplar building in Britain, even in 20 years' time. So they've taken all of the lowest energy standards and they analysed every material going into this building, not just for its carbon footprint, but the distance it's travelled. So here they have reinvigorated a local craft skill and given modern technological techniques to a local tradition. But they analysed the physical distance of every material in this building so that the carbon footprint of how the material travelled to site, literally the wood from over there, the grass from over there. They even, for the insulation, tested the local turkey feathers from the farm next door. And so inside, again, we tried to minimise. Our aim was to not put any light in here at all. And so what we've tried to do is, again, just implement localised power to where the furniture is. We already have low-level power circuits within any building. But within the ceiling, if we say there's no lights in the ceiling, we've removed the copper, we've removed the aluminium, etc. The only place where we had to put lighting in the ceiling is because of very stringent codes to do with fire safety and emergency lighting. So there is only this one detail that had to be there for the emergency lighting, but that one detail is used to integrate and blend. But if there is light in that space, you physically cannot switch it on. So I've had the joy of entering this project into lots of lighting awards, and we've even had comments coming back from the judges as they go around going, we can't see any light fittings. I say, yes, that's the whole point. But here you can see, yes, slightly overexposed photograph, is the building dull? Is the building not lit? Again, utilising the sensitivity of the eye. This is actually day lit. This is the evening condition where the lighting is responding to the light that's dropped just below here. There's a slight accent on the staircase, but up here where there is still sufficient light, the lights are not switching on. And then through the space, blending, we influence the daylight design to bring daylight directly into the middle. Here, actually go to the nighttime shot for you to see where that light is. Again, the lights only come on when people are present. When I had the judges come to view this project, we had to wait 3 hours before I could switch any of the lights on. But what we're achieving with this is a watts per square metre or an annual power consumption. Again, 20% of what's seen as an excellent standard, with that low in terms of annualised energy consumption. Now the last couple of projects just show that idea, but used in a sort of softer, more gentle way. We're not aiming for zero carbon. But here within a day-lit atrium, the central purpose for a Royal Society, this is of pharmaceuticals. I nicknamed this the Harry Potter staircase. But within this day-lit atrium, there is only light local to the treads. So we're actually using the staircase as the chandelier or the light in this space. And the light is purely there where you want to read. There's no other light in this. So above your head, it gets darker and darker at night. Or, working with Zaha Hadid's, we're able to influence them. We found them actually very friendly architects to work with. They took our ideas on board and absolutely used, blended, moulded some of the space around us. Now this is essentially, in lighting terms, a sculpture in adjustment of the eye, and again this daytime, nighttime focus. What I asked for was, as you enter into this space from daylight, we want a bright ceiling, and the back wall in any space that you're adjusting into wants to be the brightest thing. So I just asked for something for me to put lamps into. They came back with this as an idea for uplighting to the ceiling, and then that flowing down the back wall and integrating into the furniture. Now also what they wanted here was this sort of river-washed sculpted look to the concrete. But here, very different from their visuals, we provided very sharp objects, almost like to the artifacts, that this space is actually, it's a showroom for Rocker, as you see, a sink manufacturer. If I showed you pictures of this, or if you're in the space, it's actually a very warm candlelit space. But what we made sure of was that all of that colour was uniform, the same colour, so photographers could adjust it as they wanted. It was important to have this candlelit warmth in there, because when you look at yourself in the mirror, you have a better skin texture as you look at yourself. So here we're just putting through an implementation for a forgotten underpass near Paddington over in West London, and we've won the competition here with this local artist to bring the beauty of the original concrete, to bring modern parametric calculation programs, but reveal the original engineer's sketches and hand drawings of how he arrived at these complex shapes. So we're just looking to get this through planning permission at the moment, but we found a really positive response from the local community that this had a generational connection. We're using modern technology to actually describe hand calculations that would have been done in the 1950s. And so here, also bringing this idea of solid ceiling over a road, but bringing the sky down to the ground. I had the joy of being James Turrell's project manager for architects, and this was a real struggle of getting a James Turrell sculpture into a Richard Rogers building. The important thing here being that no lamps were visible, but within a structure that was essentially a glass staircase, how we could get these panels and bring the nighttime sky down into the base of these light wells. Here, the light wells themselves being these infinitely reflecting black spaces that you had to walk across into the interior. That then influenced what the interior design was going to be, with this warmth and also the emanation of light coming up from the floor, integrating details, no downlights. But here the spa for this building was intentionally designed as a nighttime space. The black mirror ceiling is actually a lighting detail that was entered in as part of the specification. But the actual intention of this space as an outdoor pool, happens to be 2 floors underground, is lit by the spill light from the gym. So it's actually a lighting request and an integration with working with the architect to actually make all of those walls glass floor to ceiling. And so at the same time as the Millennium Dome, this was also my first project completed in 1998. This is near Essen, and that up there is Europe's largest LED installation of the 1990s. Our client wanted to show the beauty around Essen. They don't pull down their industrial monuments. They just put Ferris wheels and slides through the middle of them. This is now a public park, and here the lighting detail is actually a hose left running in the middle of the road so that that would flood and reflect through. But here it was very important to bring that material, this nighttime environment, but this emotional quality, not just to light the material and the form. So I just want to end with exactly what lighting design is actually about. Thank you.